Damian Volkov put a gun to a 7-year-old girl's head because her father owed him $40,000. Not his men, not an enforcer. Him, personally. In a church parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon while a priest watched from the doorway and did nothing. The father dropped to his knees in the snow and begged. The girl didn't cry. She just stared up at the most powerful man in Chicago with those wide, silent eyes. The kind of eyes that have already learned the world isn't fair. Damien didn't pull the trigger. He didn't need to. That was never the point. The point was that he could. The point was that everyone watching would remember that he could. He lowered the gun, stepped over the kneeling man, and drove away. And somewhere across the city, a woman who had been watching through a long-range scope slowly exhaled and began making a different plan entirely. If you've ever asked yourself what you would do when the system fails completely, when the law looks away and the powerful do whatever they want, then this story is for you. Stay with us all the way to the end. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, right now is the perfect moment, because the story you're about to hear will keep you up tonight. And we have more coming that you absolutely cannot miss. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Her name was Sienna Mercer, and she hadn't slept in a real bed in 11 months. That wasn't a complaint. It was just a fact. The kind of fact she cataloged alongside other facts like ammunition count and exit routes and how many seconds before a man's knee stops working after a precise strike to the lateral ligament. Sienna collected facts the way other people collected comfort. Facts didn't betray you. Facts didn't get 3 children killed in a mountain village while you stood 40 meters away and made the wrong call. She was 38 years old. She looked 45. She moved like someone who was 25 and had decided to spend every one of those extra years learning how to survive things that should have killed her. The warehouse she was currently living in had belonged to a shipping company that folded in 2019. The roof leaked when it rained. She'd positioned a plastic bucket under the main drip and used the sound of water hitting plastic to tell her how hard it was raining outside, which told her how much visibility she'd have, which told her whether tonight was a night for moving or staying. Everything in Sienna's life was information. Everything had a secondary purpose. She was eating a gas station sandwich and reviewing photographs when her phone buzzed. Not her real phone. The burner. The one only 3 people in the world had the number to, and 2 of them were dead. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, which meant Marcus. Marcus was the kind of man who changed his number every 10 days because he'd once watched someone get shot for keeping the same SIM card too long. He was also, inconveniently, the most reliable source of street-level intelligence between Gary, Indiana, and the Illinois border. She answered without speaking. "You see the thing on Milburn Street?" Marcus said. "No hello." They'd never done hellos. "I heard about it." "You heard about it, or you were there?" She took a bite of her sandwich. Turkey on white, room temperature. It tasted like cardboard, and she ate it anyway because calories were calories. "What do you want, Marcus?" "I want to know if you're going to do something stupid." "I do something stupid every 3 days approximately. You're going to need to be more specific." On the other end, she heard him exhale. That specific exhale. The one that meant he was sitting somewhere he didn't feel safe and trying not to show it. Volkov moved a shipment through the Milburn rail yard 2 nights ago. 12 people. Maybe 14. They came up through the southern route, the one you burned last March, except they found a new branch off it, runs parallel about 4 blocks east. Sienna stopped chewing. "I know," Marcus said, reading her silence correctly. "I know. But here's the thing. They're not all gone yet. There's a holding point, industrial freezer unit, old Hartman and Sons facility on Caldwell. They're keeping them there until the transfer, 48 hours, maybe 72. How many guards? 6 that I've seen, probably 8 counting the ones inside. And Sienna..." He paused. That pause meant something was coming she wouldn't like. "One of them is Gregor. Gregor Vance, 6'4", former Romanian military. Spent 4 years as Volkov's head of internal enforcement before apparently being reassigned to what Sienna suspected was grunt security work, which probably meant he'd done something to fall out of favor, which meant he'd be angry, which meant he'd be unpredictable. None of that made this easier. "I'll look at it tonight," she said. "I said look, not, I know what you said. She hung up and finished the sandwich. The Hartman and Sons facility was not subtle. This was the thing about Volkov's operation that had always struck her as both arrogant and strangely efficient. He didn't try to hide things the way careful criminals did. He hid things in plain sight, behind the kind of ordinary ugliness that people stopped seeing after a while. An old industrial building in a neighborhood where old industrial buildings were so common they'd become invisible. A parking lot with 4 vehicles that looked like exactly the kind of vehicles workers drove. Lights that stayed off at the right times and on at the right times. Sienna spent 40 minutes in a building across the street doing nothing but watching. She counted 6 guard rotations, identified 2 smokers who went outside at intervals, one every 23 minutes, one who seemed less disciplined, going out whenever he felt like it. That second one was a problem. Unpredictable rhythms created windows you couldn't predict, which meant you couldn't plan around them, which meant you had to improvise, which was how people got hurt. She did not particularly want to get hurt tonight. She dropped off the building's fire escape and moved through a gap between 2 chain-link fences that she'd identified from satellite imagery 3 weeks earlier, not because she'd known she'd need it specifically, but because she cataloged these things the way some people cataloged recipes. Just in case. The lock on the facility's east maintenance door was a Schlager series that would take her about 40 seconds to defeat. She'd practiced the motion on an identical lock in her warehouse until she could do it without looking. She moved to the door, knelt down, and the unpredictable smoker came around the corner. They were both surprised. That was the honest truth of it. This wasn't one of those moments where a trained operative smoothly transitions into a combat posture with perfect confidence. Sienna's heart jumped. Her fingers tightened on the pick tools. The man, mid-30s, thick through the shoulders, a cigarette hanging half-lit from his lip, stared at her for a full second with an expression that said his brain hadn't yet told his body what to do. She moved first. Not a clean cinematic sequence. She drove her elbow into his throat, grabbed his collar to control where he fell, kept his head from cracking against the pavement, and had his arm pinned at an angle that would end badly for him if he struggled, all in about 3 seconds. He made a strangled sound. The cigarette dropped. "Don't," she said quietly, not threatening, almost gentle. "I'm not here for you." He stared at her, watering eyes, face going red. "Nod if you understand me." He nodded. Small, jerky motion. "There are people inside this building being held against their will." She said it plainly, watching his face. She'd learned a long time ago that the way someone reacted to that sentence told you almost everything about who they were. "You can help me get them out, or you can go to sleep for a few hours and wake up with a sore throat and tell your boss you didn't see anything. Either way, I'm going in." His eyes shifted. Something crossed his face. It wasn't conscience exactly, more like a crack in a wall that had been there a long time. "There's kids in there," he said, voice wrecked from the elbow. "2 of them." Sienna felt something go cold and still inside her chest. The professional, managed kind of cold, not the panicked kind. "How many total?" 11, 12, I don't..." He swallowed. "I didn't sign up for the kids part." "Nobody ever does," she said. "Sleep." She applied pressure to a specific point at the junction of his jaw and neck, held it for 5 seconds, and lowered him carefully to the ground. He'd wake up with a headache. He'd have a story he could choose to tell or not tell, and something in her read him as a man who would choose not to tell it. She might be wrong. She'd been wrong before. 3 children in a mountain village. She picked the lock in 37 seconds, personal best. What she found inside the Hartman and Sons facility would take her hours to process fully, but her brain cataloged it in the first 10 seconds the way a trained eye catalogs a crime scene. 12 people, Marcus had been right, in a space designed for cold storage that someone had tried to make marginally habitable with cots and a space heater that wasn't doing nearly enough work. 2 children, a boy of maybe 8 and a girl younger than that, sitting very close together in the way that meant they hadn't been separated yet, which was the one mercy in an otherwise merciless situation. Adults in varying states of physical distress. 2 women who looked like they hadn't slept in days. A man with a bandaged hand that had been done badly. Infection already setting in, she could see it from the doorway. And inside, 2 guards. The first one was facing away from her, which was luck. The second one was not, which was the problem. She had approximately 2 seconds before the second guard processed what he was seeing and raised the alarm. She spent one of those seconds making eye contact with the 8-year-old boy and doing the thing she'd learned to do, which was look completely calm, because children read adults for signals, and if she looked afraid, he would panic, and if he panicked, the guards would. She moved. The second guard got his hand to his radio before she reached him. She didn't try to stop that. Stopping the hand was slower than stopping the person. She hit him in a way that folded him without the radio getting keyed, spun to the first guard who was just turning around, and had to take a hit across the shoulder because she'd slightly miscalculated the space between two cots. It hurt. She registered it and filed it. The first guard was bigger than she'd estimated from the doorway. He grabbed her jacket with both hands and threw her. Not a small throw, a genuine throw, the kind that came from actual strength, and she had a split second to tuck her chin and take the impact across her upper back instead of her head. She hit the wall and slid down it. The room was completely silent except for the hum of the failing space heater. The big guard looked at her. She looked at him. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, and she could feel where the impact had landed, and she was making a private calculation about whether that shoulder was going to cooperate tonight. "You hit it like you've done this before," she said. He blinked. It wasn't what he'd expected. "I'm going to get up now," she said, "and then we're going to finish this, and one of us is going to walk out of here and one of us isn't. And I'd like it to be me, but I want you to know I'm giving you the option to just sit down." He charged instead. People almost always charged. The shoulder cooperated. Barely. It took her 19 minutes to get 12 people out of the Hartman and Sons facility, through the east maintenance door, and across the chain-link corridor, and into a position where she could make the calls she needed to make. The anonymous calls, through the relay she'd set up, to the specific channel at Chicago PD that wasn't yet compromised by Volkov's reach. 19 minutes. 4 more guards she'd had to deal with inside. One moment where the girl, the younger one, maybe 6, had frozen completely and wouldn't move, and Sienna had made the call that you always had to make in those situations, which was to pick the child up and run and worry about the psychological complexity of that later. The man with the infected hand needed hospital care immediately. She told him the name of an ER doctor 3 miles away who asked fewer questions than most. The last thing she did before she left was crouch down in front of the 8-year-old boy. He'd been remarkable throughout the whole thing, quiet, controlled, following her directions exactly. The kind of kid who'd learned early that the adults around him couldn't always be trusted, but was still willing to place a small, careful bet on her. "You did good," she told him. He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you going to be okay?" She hadn't expected that. The shoulder was throbbing steadily now. There was blood on her jacket from somewhere she hadn't fully accounted for yet. She was going to need the next 48 hours to go very carefully. "I'm going to be fine," she said. He didn't entirely believe her. She could see it. He nodded anyway, the way kids nod when they decide to extend trust, even when they're not sure it's earned. She walked away through the dark, and she did not look back, because she had learned a long time ago that looking back made it harder to go forward. 3 blocks away, her phone buzzed again. Marcus. She didn't answer. Instead, she checked the shoulder, found the source of the bleeding, a cut above her collarbone, not deep, from the wall impact, and pressed her sleeve against it and walked. Somewhere across the city, Damian Volkov was sitting in a restaurant he owned, eating a meal he hadn't cooked himself, receiving a phone call about a facility that had just gone dark. She didn't know that yet, but she would. The photograph appeared on Damian's desk the following morning. It was surveillance footage, printed, grainy. The way all surveillance footage printed was grainy, like the technology had made a philosophical decision to always be slightly unclear about the details. It showed a figure moving through the Hartman exterior, captured in a camera angle that should have been blocked, but hadn't quite been. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. The figure was slight, moving fast. Moving, his security chief noted, in a way that suggested very specific training, not the general violence of street muscle, but something more deliberate. Damian looked at the photograph for a long time. "This was one person," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." He picked up the photograph, looked at the angle of the figure's posture, mid-movement, weight low, something tucked against the body that his security chief said was probably a person, probably the child. Running. moving through the space like someone who had already decided exactly where every foot was going to land before it landed. "Find out who she is," he said. The security chief hesitated. "She?" Damien set the photograph down. "Find out who she is." His security chief, a man named Pavel, who had worked for Damien for 11 years and who had never once questioned a direct order, looked at the photograph again. The stance, the grip, the way the figure moved with something held close to the chest. "Yes, sir," Pavel said. Damien poured himself a coffee and stood at his window and looked out at Chicago in the early morning. The lake flat and gray in the distance, the city starting its machinery of the ordinary day. And he thought about what it meant that 12 people had walked out of a facility his organization had secured at the hands of one person in the middle of the night. He thought about the girl in the church parking lot. He thought about the father on his knees. He thought about how he had walked away because he didn't need to pull the trigger, because the point was that he could. Something about the photograph bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately name. Not anger, not the professional insult of a compromised operation. Something else. Something quieter. He didn't name it yet. He went back to his breakfast. Sienna spent the morning. She should have been resting, doing two things: cleaning the cut above her collarbone with supplies from a kit she kept in a waterproof bag wedged behind a loose wall panel, and listening to a police scanner frequency she'd bookmarked 9 months ago. The scanner confirmed that the 12 people from Hartman had been found and processed. The word the system used, processed, which always made her jaw tighten because it described human beings like freight. 11 of them were in protective custody. One had been transferred to the hospital Marcus had mentioned, the man with the infected hand. She didn't know yet if that would be enough. The girl, the 8-year-old boy. She ran calculations on their likely processing trajectory through a system that was, at best, strained, and at worst, porous in ways that Volkov's people had learned to exploit years ago. She made a note. Followed up with a contact who would not explain how they knew certain things, and who could sometimes quietly redirect outcomes within the protective custody framework. Then she lay down on the cot she'd set up in the warehouse's east corner because it was the corner farthest from the windows, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the boy saying, "Are you going to be okay?" The shoulder hurt. She made herself breathe through it. "You did good," she had told him. What she hadn't told him was that 11 people out of a facility of 12 wasn't success. It was math. It was better math than she'd had 3 years ago, in a mountain village where the math had been much worse. There was no version of this work that didn't leave you counting. She counted until she fell asleep, and she dreamed about the mountain, and she woke up an hour later when her perimeter alarm, a simple pressure-sensitive wire across the warehouse's main door, triggered a vibration in the wristband she wore even sleeping. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. Someone was in the building. It wasn't Volkov's men. She recognized that within the first 10 seconds from the sound of the footsteps. Single set, no tactical spacing, no radio silence discipline, not fanning out to cover exits. Just someone walking toward her corner with the uncertain cadence of a person who didn't know exactly where they were going. She waited behind a support pillar until the figure came into the dim light from the high windows. It was the smoker from last night. The unpredictable one. The one she'd put to sleep outside the Hartman maintenance store. He stopped when he saw her. Raised both hands. The universal signal that people made when they'd seen enough movies to know that was what you did. "I'm not here for anything bad," he said. I needed to talk to someone." Sienna looked at him for a moment. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept, which made two of them. His throat was visibly bruised where her elbow had landed. "You followed me," she said. "Not exactly." He lowered his hand slowly. "I know Marcus. Not well. But I know him. He mentioned someone once, described the warehouse district. I took a guess." Marcus was going to hear about this. Marcus was going to hear about this at length. "What do you want?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not calculating quiet. Uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of someone who had a thing to say and wasn't sure they had the right to say it. "The kids," he finally said. "They got out okay?" Something in Sienna's chest loosened a fraction that she didn't show on her face. "Yes." He nodded, let out a breath that seemed like it had been sitting in his chest for a while. I've been doing this work for 8 months, he said. For Volkov. Not, I'm not going to say I didn't know what I was getting into. I knew what I was getting into. I needed the money, and I told myself the security work was just security work. He paused. But the kids. But the kids, she agreed. I don't know what I'm asking for. I do, she said. You're asking if there's another way out. He looked at her. There usually is, she said. It's almost never easy, and it's almost never safe, and it requires you to be willing to do things that feel like they cost more than they give back for a long time before anything gets better. She paused. But there usually is. He was quiet for a moment. Who are you? No one important? That's not true. She looked at him, the bruised throat, the sleepless eyes, the particular posture of someone standing at a door. They weren't sure they were allowed to walk through. She thought about the boy, the girl frozen in place, the man with the infected hand. She thought about what it cost to start over when the thing you were starting over from was yourself. My name is Sienna, she said. What's yours? Ray. Ray. She nodded once. Go home and get some sleep. Don't go back to the Hartman facility or any Volkov site tomorrow. I'll find you in 48 hours and we'll talk about what comes next. He looked at her like he was checking whether she meant it. She did. She almost always meant it. Okay, he said. He left. She listened to his footsteps recede through the warehouse, heard the door, heard silence. She went back to her cot and lay down and did not sleep for a long time. Because 48 hours from now, she already knew things were going to be different. Pavel's people would have her description from the Hartman cameras. They would be cross-referencing databases. They would be working a trail that she had not been as careful to hide as she usually was, because the shoulder had been worse than she'd admitted to herself, and she'd made 3 small errors in the final extraction that a rested version of herself would not have made. Damien Volkov was going to know her name soon. She wasn't sure yet how she felt about that. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in a restaurant he owned, he was looking at her photograph. And for the first time in years, Damien Volkov was asking questions instead of giving orders. Neither of them could have told you, at that moment, where that led. Pavel found her name in 31 hours. Not 31 hours of clean, methodical database work. 31 hours of dead ends, wrong branches, and a military record that had been partially sealed in a way that told you more about what was inside it than any open file could. The sealing itself was information. You didn't seal a record like that unless what was in it was either very good or very bad, and Pavel had been doing this work long enough to know that the line between those two things was thinner than most people admitted. He laid the file on Damien's desk at 6:40 in the morning. Damien was already there. He was almost always already there, which was one of the things about him that his organization interpreted as discipline, but was actually something closer to insomnia dressed up in a suit. Damien looked at the file without touching it for a moment. Then he opened it. Sienna Mercer, age 38, former U.S. Army Intelligence, rank of Staff Sergeant, served 8 years with a record that the visible portions described in language so neutral it had clearly been scrubbed. 2 commendations. 1 incident report dated 4 years ago that referenced a mission in a location redacted to a black bar, with an outcome described only as adverse. Medical discharge 6 months after that. No fixed address on record. No active financial trail. He looked at the photograph clipped to the inside cover. Military ID photo, 4 years old. She looked younger in it, not soft, but less carved down to the essential. The kind of face that had been through the machine since and come out the other side thinner and harder and more itself. This is everything, he said. Everything accessible, Pavel said. The rest is behind federal seals. I can push further, but it would require... Don't. Damien closed the file, picked up his coffee. What do we know about the past 8 months? Before last night. Pavel had prepared for this. He laid a second folder on the desk. Thinner, assembled from what his network had been able to reconstruct. 3 operations Volkov's organization had run that had subsequently collapsed without explanation. A warehouse on the south side that had been cleared out 12 hours before a scheduled transfer. A financial courier who had arrived at his destination to find police waiting and had initially, incorrectly, blamed an internal leak before the investigation had revealed no leak at all. Just a woman who had followed him for 9 days and made a series of phone calls from relay numbers that didn't trace back to anything. Damien read through it slowly. Pavel watched him read, which was something Pavel was good at, watching people's faces while they processed information and noting what the face did and didn't do. Damien's, as usual, gave away very little. But there was something around the eyes. Not surprise. Something more like recognition. She's been working against us for 8 months, Damien said. At minimum, possibly longer. We may have attributed some earlier incidents to rival organizations. Damien set the folder down. He looked out the window. The lake was doing what it did in the early morning, lying there, completely indifferent to everything. How many people has she gotten out? Pavel paused. He hadn't expected that to be the next question. We estimate between 40 and 60. Across the incidents we can attribute with confidence. Damien said nothing. Sir, the operational concern is, I know what the operational concern is. He said it without heat, flat and final. Pavel waited. Find her, Damien said. Don't touch her. Find her and watch her and tell me everything she does for the next 72 hours. Pavel had worked for Damien for 11 years. In 11 years he had received orders he understood and orders he didn't, and he had learned to execute both with equal precision. This was one he didn't understand, and he filed that in the same place he filed all the things he didn't understand, behind his face, where it would stay until it became relevant. Yes, sir, he said. He picked up the folders and left. Damien stood at the window with his coffee and looked at the city and thought about 40 to 60 people. Not as an operational problem, but as a number. A count. The kind of count that had weight to it. He didn't name what he was feeling. He was not, in general, a man who named what he was feeling, but it was there. The news about Hartman reached Gregor Vance through a contact at 7 in the morning, and by 7:15 he was in a car driving too fast down the Eisenhower with both hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Gregor was 44 years old and had spent the past 4 years believing, with the particular conviction of a man who had been humiliated by a demotion and was too proud to acknowledge it as a demotion, that he was still essential to Volkov's organization, that the reassignment to facility security was temporary, that his expertise was simply being held in reserve. The Hartman facility had been his assignment, his responsibility. 6 guards in a locked building and 12 people who were supposed to stay put until the transfer, and somehow, in the middle of the night, one person had walked in and walked all 12 of them out. He was past angry. Anger was something Gregor understood. It was clean. It had edges. What he was feeling now was colder than anger and less manageable. It was the specific feeling of a man watching the last supporting wall of a story he told himself for years begin to crack. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Pavel. He answered. Gregor. Pavel's voice carried the particular neutrality of someone who was about to say something that would be received badly. Mr. Volkov wants you to understand that the Hartman situation is being handled at the organizational level. You don't need to... I had 6 men on that building. I'm aware. 6 men and 1 woman walked in and... Gregor. Slight emphasis. Slight. The kind of emphasis that, from Pavel, was equivalent to another man raising his voice. Mr. Volkov does not want you in the field on this. He wants you to stand down. Gregor stared at the road. A truck in front of him was going 45. He passed it on the right. She made me look like an idiot, he said. She made the organization look compromised. That's Mr. Volkov's concern, not yours personally. It is personally. Gregor, he hung up. Pavel, 3 miles away, looked at his phone, set it down, made a note in the way that Pavel made notes, not on paper, but in the part of his mind where he stored things that were going to become problems. Gregor Vance was going to become a problem. Sienna didn't know about Gregor yet. She knew about Pavel in the abstract. She'd identified him as Volkov's operational coordinator 8 months ago from a combination of surveillance and careful pattern analysis. She hadn't been able to confirm his identity with certainty, but she knew the role, and she knew the role had been filled by someone competent, and she factored that competence into everything she planned. What she was doing right now, at 8:30 in the morning, was standing outside a coffee shop on the north side watching a man named Carl Dreiser try to decide if he was being followed. Carl Dreiser was Volkov's city council contact, not on payroll. It was more elegant than that. Carl Dreiser received campaign contributions through 3 layers of legitimate-looking fundraising, and in return, certain zoning decisions went certain ways, Certain inspectors were reassigned before certain visits, and certain information that moved through city government channels arrived eventually in Pavel's hands. Sienna had been building a file on Carl Dreiser for 4 months. She had documentation of 11 transactions. She had, through a contact she'd cultivated in the city clerk's office, over 6 months of careful, patient relationship building. Not manipulation, just genuine human contact, because Sienna had learned the hard way that manufactured friendships collapsed under pressure. Copies of 3 communications that would be difficult to explain. She wasn't going to send the file to the press. She'd done that once, early in this work, and watched a story get buried because the paper was scared and the source was unverifiable, and the editor had made a calculation about what he could survive. She was going to send it to a specific prosecutor's office, a woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Diana Reyes, who had been building a RICO case on the fringes of Volkov's operation for 2 years, and who lacked, as near as Sienna could tell, exactly the kind of city government link documentation that Sienna currently had. She was waiting for Carl Dreiser to go inside the coffee shop, sit down, meet the person she'd watched him meet here every Thursday for 11 weeks, and take the envelope. Carl Dreiser went inside, sat down, met the person, a man in a gray jacket whose face Sienna had documented but not yet identified, took the envelope. Sienna photographed all of it through a lens that cost more than 2 months of any salary she'd ever earned, and that she'd bought with money recovered from a cash courier she'd intercepted 6 months ago and delivered anonymously to a victim assistance fund, all except the amount she needed for the lens. She lowered the camera. Her phone buzzed. Marcus again. She answered this time. "They're looking for you," he said. "I assumed." "No, Sienna. I mean, they're looking for you. Pavel's people are running a network canvas. They're talking to everyone. They've got your description out to every contact they have in the city." She felt the particular stillness that came over her in moments that required her to be very clear about what she was feeling versus what she needed to do. She was feeling something that wasn't quite fear. Fear was sharp and loud, and this was quieter, more like a door closing slowly in a large room. She needed to move the file on Dreiser to Reyes faster than she'd planned. She needed to relocate the warehouse. She needed to contact Ray and accelerate whatever she'd been planning to do in 48 hours. "How broad is the canvas?" she said. "North side, south side, the whole rail corridor. They've got your description down to the jacket you were wearing at Hartman." He paused. Someone talked. She thought about the smoker. Ray. She thought about putting him to sleep outside that door and waking up and making a calculation about his character. She ran it again now, fast, looking for the place she'd gone wrong. She didn't find it, which meant either she'd been right about him and it was someone else, or she'd been right about him, but it didn't matter because someone else had seen her and she hadn't known. "Was it the man outside the east door?" she said. "I don't know which man." "The smoker. The one I put down before I went in." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I heard Gregor's been asking around personally, not through Pavel, separately." That was new information, and it landed differently than the rest. Gregor operating separately from Pavel meant Gregor operating outside Volkov's instructions, which meant there was a fracture in the organization's response to her, which was useful, which was also dangerous in a specific way, because fractured responses produced unpredictable actors, and unpredictable actors did things that careful planning couldn't account for. "Marcus," she said, "how much exposure do you have right now?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." Another pause, longer. "I've got a name out there that's connected to some information that got to you. If Pavel's people trace it back, get out of your apartment tonight." "Sienna?" "Tonight, Marcus. Use the arrangement we set up. You know where to go." "I know where to go," he said. He sounded tired. He was always tired, had been tired for as long as she'd known him, the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent years existing in the space between sides and was still somehow surprised that the space was uncomfortable. "I'll handle the rest," she said. "You can't handle everything. I handle what's in front of me and work backward from there." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You know what your problem is? Tell me. You've got no one to call when you're the one who needs backup." She watched Carl Dreiser through the coffee shop window, standing up now, buttoning his coat. "I've got you. I mean real backup." She didn't answer that. She ended the call and photographed Dreiser shaking the gray jacket man's hand and walking out, Gregor found Ray at 11 that morning. Ray hadn't gone back to any Volkov facility. He'd done what Sienna told him, which was go home and sleep. And he'd actually done it because the conversation in the warehouse had done something to him that he didn't have good language for. But home for Ray was a third-floor apartment in Pilsen with a door that could be opened by anyone who'd ever opened a door before. And Gregor had 7 years of knowing which rocks to look under when he needed to find someone. Ray opened the door because the knock was police pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. And Gregor had known Ray long enough to know he'd open for that before he thought about it. When he saw Gregor, he tried to close the door. Gregor's hand was faster. He didn't hurt Ray. That was in its way more frightening. Gregor not hurting someone when he had every technical justification to was Gregor making a statement about how certain he was of the outcome. He just pushed the door open and walked in and stood in Ray's kitchen, which smelled like coffee and old takeout containers, and looked at Ray with the specific look that Gregor had spent 20 years cultivating, the look that said, I already know. So the question is just which version of this conversation you want to have. Ray's throat, still bruised, worked. She talked to you, Gregor said. I don't know what you're... Ray. Flat, patient. I've got a camera positioned on the Hartman East exterior. We put it up 3 weeks ago, covers the whole corner, you just can't see it from ground level. It caught you talking to her. So I know she talked to you. The question is what she said and where she is. Ray looked at his kitchen counter, at the coffee maker, at anywhere that wasn't Gregor. She put me down in about 4 seconds, Ray said finally. What makes you think I know anything useful? Because she let you live and let you go, which means she said something to you. And when she says something to someone, it means she wants something from them. And the something she wants is always the same thing. She wants information, and she wants to turn people. Gregor said it without particular heat, the way you described a mechanism. So, what did she say? She said she was going to get the people out of the building. And then, Ray's jaw tightened, and then she knocked me out. Gregor looked at him for a long moment. Ray had the particular look of someone who was telling the truth about one thing and lying about something adjacent, and Gregor had been reading that combination for 20 years. You went to see her after, Gregor said. The color left Ray's face in a way that was its own answer. Gregor moved. Not violent. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and opened the cabinet above the sink and took down the glass that was there and filled it with water from the tap and set it on the counter in front of Ray. And the deliberateness of the sequence was somehow worse than aggression would have been. Where? Gregor said. I don't know. Warehouse somewhere. I didn't catch a street. Warehouse district. Ray said nothing. North side or south? Gregor's north or south? North. It came out like something breaking. Ray picked up the water glass and set it down without drinking. North side. That's all I know. I swear that's all I know. Gregor looked at him for a long moment. Then he straightened up. Stay in this apartment, he said. Don't call anyone. Don't text anyone. I'll know if you do. He paused at the door. You made a stupid choice, Ray. People make stupid choices. The question is whether you make another one. He left. Ray stood in his kitchen shaking slightly. After a moment, he picked up the water glass and actually drank from it this time, and his hand was not steady. He did not reach for his phone. He thought about Sienna saying there usually is another way out. He stood there for a long time thinking about that. The file on Carl Dreiser arrived at Diana Rhea's office through a courier service at 2 in the afternoon. Not email, not digital, because digital left traces that Sienna had learned not to trust, but a physical drive in a padded envelope with documentation printed and organized with the kind of careful indexing that had led Reyes, the one other time she'd received something like this from the same anonymous source, to tell her paralegal that whoever was sending these things had missed their calling as a federal evidence specialist. Reyes read through it in her office with the door closed. She was 41 years old, built like someone who had once been an athlete and had not entirely stopped, with the particular focused expression of a person who was used to receiving information that confirmed what she'd already suspected and still made herself feel the weight of the confirmation anyway. She read the documentation on Carl Dreiser twice. Then she called her lead investigator. Clear your Thursday, she said. On the other end, her investigator started to ask why, and then stopped, because Reyes's tone had the particular quality it had when something had finally come through. Yeah, he said instead. Okay. She hung up and looked at the drive in her hand and thought about the anonymous source, thought about what kind of person did this work, sent files to prosecutors and freed people from locked buildings and left no name and no contact. And she thought that she'd been in law for 17 years, and she'd never been able to decide if that person was the most moral actor she'd never met or the most dangerous one. Probably, she thought, both. Sienna had relocated by 3 in the afternoon. The new location was a space she'd identified 3 months ago as a backup, a decommissioned commercial laundry facility 3 miles northeast of the warehouse, with loading dock access and a second egress through an interior corridor that opened onto a parallel alley. She'd moved light, the waterproof bag, the camera, 2 changes of clothes, the kit, the 2 phones, and a folder of documents she hadn't yet delivered that she was not willing to leave behind. She was setting up the perimeter wire when Ray's number, she'd given him a burner number at the end of the warehouse conversation, a one-way contact for emergencies, appeared on the secondary phone. She answered. "Gregor came to my apartment," Ray said. His voice had the careful steadiness of someone who had already processed their fear and was now on the other side of it, in the flat country. "This morning. He knows I talked to you. He knows the warehouse was on the north side. He doesn't have the specific location, but he's got enough to work with." Sienna finished attaching the wire to the door frame while he talked. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Did he threaten you?" "Not in words." A pause. "Sienna, he's not going through Pavel with this. He's working it separately." "I know. That means he's not stopping when Volkov tells him to stop." "I know, Ray." She stepped back and looked at the wire, adjusted the tension. "Are you still in the apartment?" "Yes." "Get out, now, tonight. Use the name I gave you at the shelter intake contact. They'll place you without a file. Don't use your credit cards and don't contact anyone from the organization." "What about you?" She looked around the laundry facility, the bare concrete walls, the rusted drum housings, the light coming through grime-coated skylights at a flat afternoon angle. It smelled like old detergent and disuse. "I'm fine," she said. "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." "Sienna." Something in his voice shifted. Not fear, something more complicated. "Gregor's been with Volkov for 20 years. He's got reach I don't even know the edges of. He's going to find you." She thought about the photograph on Damien's desk. She thought about Pavel's network canvas running across the whole city. She thought about Ray's fractured answer, north side, that's all I know, and calculated how much time that bought her and what she could do with it. "Get out of the apartment, Ray," she said. "Do it in the next hour." She ended the call. She sat down on an overturned industrial drum and breathed for a moment, just breathed. The shoulder had stiffened overnight and was less cooperative today than yesterday, and she'd been running on 4 hours of sleep and a gas station sandwich, and now she had Gregor Vance, unpredictable, 20 years of violence and unmanaged pride, and a very specific reason to want to find her, working a trail that was closer than she'd have liked. She thought about Marcus. She thought about whether he'd gotten out. She thought about the boy in the Hartman facility saying, "Are you going to be okay?" She thought about Diana Reyes reading the Dreiser file right now, and what might move, and how fast, and whether fast enough was a thing that existed in this situation. Then she stood up and stopped thinking about all of it, and went back to setting up the perimeter wire, because the wire was what was in front of her, and the wire was what she could control. Gregor found the original warehouse at 8 that night, not through Ray's information alone, through Ray's information combined with 3 other sources he'd been running simultaneously, a pattern of pressure that he'd been good at for 20 years, and that he applied now with the focused intensity of a man who had something to prove to himself more than to anyone else. The warehouse was empty. She'd cleared it cleanly. No trace that he could immediately identify, just the ghost of recent occupation in the specific stillness of a space that had held someone and then released them. The cot position in the east corner, the water bucket under the roof leak, the small, precise mark on the wall where the perimeter wire anchor had been pulled free. He stood in the middle of the warehouse for a long time. Then he called a number that was not Pavel's number and was not in any directory connected to Volkov's organization. And when the man on the other end answered, Gregor said 3 words. "She's still north." The man on the other end said, "How many people do you want?" Gregor looked at the anchor mark on the wall. He thought about the Hartman footage. He thought about 6 men and 1 woman and how the math had worked out. 12, he said, "and I want them quiet. Nothing that makes the news." "That costs more." "I know what it costs." He hung up and stood in the empty warehouse and felt, for the first time in 3 days, like the ground was under his feet again. He didn't tell Pavel. He didn't tell Volkov. He told himself this was operational efficiency, that going through channels would take time he didn't have and create visibility he didn't want. He told himself a lot of things. The thing he didn't tell himself, the thing that sat just under all the other things, was that this had stopped being about the organization 8 hours ago. This was about a woman who had looked at 6 of his men and done the math and won, and he was going to correct that calculation personally. The message reached Sienna at 11:45 at night, through a channel she'd nearly forgotten she'd set up, a dead drop arrangement with a contact inside one of Volkov's lower-tier financial operations, a woman named Judith, who had been quietly feeding her information for 4 months in exchange for help with a situation Sienna had resolved, and that Judith had never fully acknowledged, and that Sienna had never asked her to. The message was short. 4 words and a number. Gregor, 12 men. Tonight. Sienna read it twice. Her heartbeat did not change. She had learned, somewhere in 8 years of military and 3 years of this, to keep her heartbeat out of the equation when the equation got bad, to push it to the side and work the numbers without it. 12 men. Tonight. And Gregor, which was not 12 men plus a coordinator, Gregor was 12 men plus a 20-year veteran who was operating outside his organization's instructions, which meant he was operating without limits. She thought about her options. She laid them out flat and looked at each one. She could run. She was good at running. She'd been doing it for months in the sense that she'd been staying ahead of identification, staying mobile, staying unattached to any fixed point. She could disappear from Chicago tonight and build a new base of operations elsewhere and start the work over. She thought about the Dreiser file on Reyes's desk. She thought about 2 children, the boy, the girl, Tarai, somewhere in a protective custody system that leaked. She thought about Ray, wherever he was tonight. She thought about Marcus. She thought about a mountain village and 3 children and the word adverse in a medical discharge report. Running meant all of it mattered for only as long as she'd been here. Running meant Gregor found the next person who was doing this work and made an example of them. Running meant the version of herself that had started this 3 years ago had been wrong about whether it was possible to stay. She put the message down. She picked up her phone, the real one, the one she almost never used, the one only Marcus had, and that she'd had for 2 years and never once used for anything except the thing she was about to use it for. She called the number. It rang 3 times. Pavel answered. Not Volkov. Pavel. Which meant she'd been right about which number to call, because Pavel was the one who answered at midnight, and Pavel was the one who would relay what she was about to say without the distortion of anger or pride. This is Sienna Mercer, she said. I need 30 minutes with Damian Volkov, tomorrow, alone. No weapons check, no surveillance. I'll know if there's surveillance. Tell him I know about the captain. Silence on the other end, long enough that she counted it. What captain? Pavel said. He'll know, she said. Tell him I know what happened 4 years ago, and I know he didn't order it, and I know why that matters. Another silence. Tell him I'm not calling to make a deal, she said. I'm calling because we have the same problem, and one of us has to say it out loud first. She ended the call. She set the phone down on the concrete floor of the laundry facility and looked at it for a long time. Somewhere on the north side of Chicago, 12 men were being briefed on a location that was 1 degree of separation away from where she was sitting. Gregor Vance was loading a weapon that he intended to use on her specifically. Pavel was standing somewhere quiet, looking at his phone, making the calculation of whether to tell Damian or wait until morning, and Sienna Mercer, who had spent 3 years doing this work alone and had told herself that was the only way it could be done, had just placed a call that meant she was either about to gain the one resource she'd never had, or she had just told the most powerful criminal in Chicago exactly who she was and given him something she'd never once given any of them, her voice, her real name. No relay, no anonymity, no controlled distance. She sat on the concrete floor in the dark laundry facility with the perimeter wire humming faintly and the city making its indifferent machinery of noise outside, and she waited to find out which one it was. Pavel didn't sleep that night. This was not unusual for Pavel. He averaged perhaps 5 hours on a good week, and this was not a good week. But the quality of his wakefulness was different from the usual variety. Usually when he didn't sleep, it was because he was processing logistics, running contingencies, sorting the day's information into the correct mental folders. Tonight he sat in his car outside his building for 2 hours and did none of that. He sat with the phone in his hand and the call log open and Sienna Mercer's number, a number he'd already run twice through his contacts, and that traced, predictably, to nothing. And he thought about what she had said. "Tell him I know about the captain." There was only one captain that sentence could mean. Pavel had worked for Damian Volkov for 11 years, and in 11 years there was exactly one topic that had the specific gravity that sentence carried. One name, one set of events 4 years ago that Damian had handled in a way that was so uncharacteristically quiet, it had, at the time, made Pavel more uneasy than any explosion would have. The captain's name had been Reese Marlowe. He'd been dead for 3 years. Damian had never explained how. Pavel made a decision at 1:47 in the morning that he made very rarely, which was a decision based entirely on instinct rather than analysis. He called Damian. Damian answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "She called," Pavel said, a pause. "Who?" "Mercer. She called my direct line at 11:45. He paused. "She said to tell you she knows about the captain. She said you'd know which one." The silence that followed was not the silence of a man processing new information. It was the silence of a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and had just heard it arrive. "What does she want?" Damian said. 30 minutes, alone, tomorrow. She said she's not calling to make a deal." Pavel paused. "She said you have the same problem and someone has to say it first." Another silence, shorter. "Set it up," Damian said. "And pull Gregor back, sec. He's not taking my calls." The silence this time had a different texture. Pavel had learned to read Damian's silences the way a sailor reads weather, by the specific quality of the stillness before the change. "Then find him," Damian said, "and make him understand that what he's doing tonight is finished." Pavel looked at the dark street outside his window. "Yes, sir." He hung up and immediately called 3 numbers in sequence, activating the network of contacts that could move information across the city's criminal geography faster than any other method he knew. He did this methodically, without particular emotion, because he had learned that emotion was what you spent when you ran out of method, and he hadn't run out of method yet. What he didn't tell Damian, what he kept in the folder behind his face, was that Grigor's 12 men had already been in motion for 2 hours. Sienna heard them at 12:40. Not voices, not footsteps. A pressure change in the alley behind the loading dock, the specific absence of ambient sound that happened when bodies were positioning themselves with deliberate quiet. She'd grown up, professionally speaking, in environments where silence was never natural, where genuine quiet meant either nothing at all or something very bad, and she'd developed the ability to distinguish between the two at a level that wasn't quite instinct but was below conscious analysis. She was already moving when the first entry point was tested. She did not go for the door. She went for the interior corridor, the second egress she'd identified 3 months ago, the one that opened onto the parallel alley, moving fast and low through the dark of the laundry facility, navigating by the dim skylight residue of city light through the grime-coated glass above, past the drum housings and the equipment bays, and the long, empty stretch where the industrial machines had been removed and left clean rectangular shadows on the concrete floor. The loading dock door came in behind her. Not quietly. Whoever Gregor had hired was competent, but not exceptional. They'd waited long enough for her to be asleep, which she hadn't been, and they'd come in multiple points simultaneously, which was correct, but they'd come in the loading dock first, which was the obvious point, which told her they expected her to run toward the obvious exits. She didn't run toward the obvious exits. She hit the interior corridor door and pushed through it and came out into the parallel alley at the exact moment she heard the second team covering the front entrance move. There were 2 of them on the alley. She registered this in about a half second. The positions, the spacing, the fact that one of them had a flashlight that he hadn't turned on yet, which meant he was the more disciplined of the 2, which meant he was the more dangerous. She did not have a clean option here. She went left instead of right, and went over the fence at the alley's end the way she'd rehearsed it in her head 3 months ago when she'd identified this location, which was with one hand on the top rail and a controlled vault that put her on the other side already running. One of the 2 men shouted. Not words, just the sound men made when something happened faster than they'd expected. She was 2 blocks away before she heard the first radio communication crackle from the alley behind her. She kept running. The shoulder didn't cooperate. It had been 2 days since the Hartman Wall impact, and the tissue around the initial injury had stiffened in the specific way that stiffened tissue did when it wasn't properly rested, and at approximately the half-mile mark of running at close to full pace, it began to send signals that were not suggestions. She didn't stop. She adjusted her gait to reduce the arm swing on the left side and kept moving and did the specific breathing that converted pain from a signal into background noise. She ran 6 blocks north before she cut west, then 2 blocks before she cut south, breaking the pursuit pattern. She found a loading recessed entrance on a commercial building and pressed herself into it and made herself be still and counted her heartbeats until they came down to something manageable and listened. The city at 1 in the morning was not silent, but the specific sounds she was listening for, radio crackle, grouped footsteps, vehicles moving in search pattern, were absent. She'd lost them. The relief lasted approximately 4 seconds, because the next thing she thought was that she had lost her equipment. The waterproof bag was in the laundry facility. The camera. The folder of documents she hadn't yet delivered. 2 phones. The burner and the real one. The one she'd just used an hour ago to call Pavel. The one that now had Pavel's number in its call log. She pressed the back of her head against the cold brick and breathed. The folder. Inside the folder were 12 months of accumulated documentation. Not copies. She maintained no digital backup for this material because digital backups existed on servers, and servers could be accessed. The physical documents were the record. Source identifications, transaction evidence, witness location information for 4 people she was protecting who had agreed to cooperate with Reyes's investigation under the understanding that their locations remained known only to Sienna. If Gregor's people had the folder, they had those 4 locations. She was moving again before she finished the thought. She didn't go back to the laundry facility. Going back was what they'd be waiting for, and she knew it, which meant the folder was gone, which meant she needed to make 4 phone calls in the next 20 minutes to 4 people who had trusted her with their physical safety. She had no phone. This was the kind of moment that she had trained herself for. Not the tactical version, the psychological version, the moment when you inventory your actual resources against your actual need, and the gap between them is not small. She had her jacket. She had the kit, which she'd had on her body rather than in the bag because she'd learned not to put the kit in the bag after a situation 2 years ago. She had $60 in cash in her left boot. She had the clothes she was wearing and the muscle memory of 11 months of this work, and 4 people whose locations were now potentially in Gregor Vance's hands. She walked 3 blocks to a 24-hour diner and went to the payphone in the back hallway. She'd been cataloging working payphones in this city for 8 months because she had known, abstractly, that this moment or something like it would come, and she spent $45 of her $60 on 4 calls. The first 3 went through. She spoke fast and clear, gave no explanations, gave only the relocation information she'd prepared months ago for exactly this contingency and had kept in the only storage system she trusted completely, which was her own memory. The 4th call went to voicemail. She stood in the back hallway of a 24-hour diner at 1:30 in the morning with the payphone receiver in her hand and listened to the voicemail of a man named Thomas Webb, who was 47 years old and had witnessed a financial transaction between a Volkov lieutenant and a city building inspector 7 months ago and had agreed, after 2 months of careful conversation, to provide a formal statement to Reyes's office. She left no message. Leaving a message on a potentially compromised line was worse than leaving nothing. She hung up and stood there. Thomas Webb lived alone. He had a daughter in Minneapolis who called on Sundays. He'd told Sienna once, during one of the careful conversations, that the reason he'd agreed to cooperate was that the building the inspector had cleared, the one that shouldn't have been cleared, had subsequently had a structural failure that had injured 2 workers, and Thomas Webb had decided that a person could only watch so many things happen before the watching itself became a choice. She thought about him not answering his phone at 1:30 in the morning and told herself it meant he was asleep and that asleep was fine and that she should move and deal with what she could deal with. She moved. Damien's message reached her through a mechanism she hadn't expected. At 7 in the morning, exhausted, working on no sleep, and the last $15 of her $60, spent on coffee and a breakfast sandwich from a 24-hour place on the north side where she'd spent 3 hours at a corner table with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. She walked out onto the street and found a car parked at the curb with its hazard lights on, and a man standing beside it who was not trying to look like he was waiting for her specifically, which was exactly how she knew he was waiting for her specifically. He was young, well-dressed, entirely without the physical presentation of muscle. He held out a phone without speaking. She looked at the phone, then at him. "Mr. Volkov would like to change the location," he said. "There's an address on the phone." She took the phone, read the address. A restaurant she knew. Not a Volkov property, a neutral location, the kind of choice that was itself a message. "When?" she said. 90 minutes. She handed the phone back. "I need 20 minutes at a store first." He looked at her. The jacket, the overnight in the city presentation. "Of course." He opened the car door. She didn't get in. "I'll make my own way there." He absorbed this without visible reaction. "Of course," he said again. She walked away. Behind her, she heard him get back in the car, and the hazard light stopped. She spent 14 of her remaining $15 on a cheap phone from a convenience store, activated it with a prepaid number, and called Thomas Webb's number from it. Still voicemail. She stood on the sidewalk outside the convenience store and made herself be very clear about what she was feeling and what she needed to do with it. She was feeling the specific cold that came from 3 years of learning that the work always cost something and that you never got to choose what the currency was. She needed to get to the restaurant. She needed to have the most important conversation of the past 3 years. She needed to be present for that conversation and not split between it and Thomas Webb's unanswered phone. She put the phone in her pocket and walked toward the restaurant. Damien Volkov was already there when she arrived, which she hadn't expected, and which told her something. The restaurant was closed at this hour. That was the arrangement, clearly. The front door unlocked and the interior dim, with the particular dim of a room where the lights have been set low rather than off. Chairs still up on half the tables, a single table in the back corner set with 2 cups of coffee. No staff visible. No Pavel. No visible security. She checked the corners when she walked in. The ceiling. The kitchen door, cracked. She registered 2 men in the kitchen through the crack, still as furniture, not moving, weapons concealed. Not intervening, just there. She'd expected as much. Damien sat at the table with both hands visible on the surface and watched her come toward him with an expression that she had not been able to predict from any of the surveillance or intelligence she'd assembled over 8 months, because the expression was not what she'd been expecting from the most feared man in Chicago. It was not cold. It was not the calculated display of power she'd seen in the church parking lot photograph. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gotten so used to the weight that he'd stopped noticing it until someone pointed it out. She sat down across from him, did not touch the coffee. He looked at her for a long moment. "You look terrible," he said. "Your people had a busy night. That wasn't my instruction." "I know." She said it flatly. "Gregor operated outside your authorization, which is why I called Pavel instead of waiting." Something moved in his face. Not surprise, but a small acknowledgement of the accuracy of the read. He picked up his coffee and drank from it and looked at her over the rim. "Tell me what you know about Reese Marlowe," he said. She'd prepared for this. She laid it out cleanly, without performance, what she'd reconstructed from 3 years of working the margins of his organization, from documents and testimony and the specific shape of things that had been covered over and the specific shape of what had been left exposed. Reese Marlowe, former captain in Volkov's organization, who had spent 4 years running a trafficking operation of his own, hidden beneath the organizational structure, using Volkov's name and Volkov's network as cover without Volkov's knowledge or sanction. She watched Damien's face while she spoke. It did not change much. That was the tell. Not change was its own kind of response, the response of a man hearing something confirmed that he'd carried alone for a long time. The military operation Mountain region. The target we were given traced back to Marlowe's network. We were told it was a hostile combatant position. She paused. It wasn't. Marlowe had been using the location for transit. By the time we executed the strike, the people we were told were there were not the people who were there. The room was very quiet. 3 children, she said, and 5 adults who had nothing to do with any of it. My unit followed orders that came from intelligence that Marlowe had corrupted. We didn't know it at the time, and I didn't know the source until 8 months ago when I found a document trail that connected the intelligence corruption back to his network. Damien set down his coffee cup. He set it down very carefully. I discharged myself, she said, and I came here. Because Marlowe was dead and the people who benefited from what his network built were still operating, and because someone told me once that the only way to stop something is from the inside out. Someone told you, he said, my commanding officer, before the mission. She paused. He didn't survive it. Damien was looking at her with an expression she still couldn't entirely name. What do you want from me? He said. What I said to Pavel. Same problem. Someone has to say it first. The problem being Gregor. The problem being that Gregor is running a private operation with 12 hired men and no organizational oversight, which means when it goes wrong, and it will go wrong, it goes wrong in a way that has your name on it without your authorization, which is exactly what Marlowe did. She let that land. You know what it cost you last time, someone operating under your name without your control. His jaw tightened, just once. Then it released. You want me to hand you Gregor, he said. I want us to stop Gregor. There's a difference. There isn't much of one from where I'm sitting. From where you're sitting, she said, you have a man outside of your control who is about to do something that will bring federal attention to your organization at the exact moment a RICO case is building documents against your city council contact. She watched his face. Yes, I know about Dreiser. The file went to Reyes's office yesterday. The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence. Damien's right hand, flat on the table, shifted slightly. Not reaching for anything, just moving, the way a hand moved when the body was working to absorb something, and the hand was the only part that showed it. You sent it, he said. I've been sending things to Reyes for 4 months. Dreiser is the one that breaks the case open, which means you have approximately 72 hours before the federal pressure on your organization becomes something Gregor's private operation makes catastrophically worse. He looked at her for a very long moment. You realize what you've just told me? Yes. You've just told me that you've been working against my organization for months while simultaneously asking me for cooperation. I've been working against the parts of your organization that traffic people, she said. If you're telling me those are the same thing, then we're done talking and I'll find another way to deal with Gregor. She pushed her chair back from the table. Sit down, he said. She didn't move. Waited. He exhaled, short, controlled. Sit down, Ms. Mercer. She sat. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. What happened to Marlowe is something I handled myself. I don't need you to draw lines between his actions and mine. I'm not drawing lines. I'm telling you where the lines already are. And Rhea's case goes where it goes. I don't control what she does with the information. You could have controlled what you sent her. Yes, she said. I could have. She let that sit. She watched him understand that she was saying she'd made a choice, and that the choice had been deliberate, and that she wasn't apologizing for it. What she was not expecting was what he said next. Thomas Webb is in the hospital. The concrete floor feeling. The thing she'd been managing since 1:30 in the morning kept in the box marked "Deal with later." It opened. Since when? She said. Her voice stayed level. She was very focused on keeping it level. Since last night, Gregor's people found your folder before you called Pavel. He said it without inflection, not cruelty, just information. Webb's alive. Critical, but stable. His location was in the documents. She sat very still. The other 3 are safe, Damien said. My people have been monitoring Gregor's network since I told Pavel to pull him back. When they moved on, Webb, we intervened. He paused. We were 40 minutes too late. 40 minutes. She thought about Thomas Webb's daughter in Minneapolis who called on Sundays. She thought about Thomas Webb explaining why he'd agreed to cooperate. A person can only watch so many things happen before the watching itself becomes a choice. She thought about unanswered phones. She thought about 3 children in a mountain village and the word adverse. The box that she kept things in, the managed, professional, functional box, was making a sound she didn't trust. She breathed. Once. Twice. Where's Gregor right now? She said. We don't know exactly. He went off our network 4 hours ago. Then he knows you've been monitoring him. She stood up. The chair scraped. Which means he's not coming for me anymore. Damien looked up at her. He's going to do something visible, she said. Something public. Something that reestablishes his position before you can formally pull his authorization. He needs a win big enough to matter, and he needs it fast. And the thing he's been building toward for 3 days is not me. She was already thinking through the structure of it, laying it out in the same flat analytical space she used for everything when the emotional space was compromised and not available. What's your most exposed operation right now? The most visible? He didn't answer immediately. I was reading her. She could feel it. The same quality of assessment she'd developed toward him, now turned back. There's a meeting, he said slowly. Tomorrow night, 14 people. My senior remaining lieutenants and 3 external partners. It's been scheduled for 3 weeks. Gregor knows about it. Everyone in my organization knows about it. She looked at him. He looked at her. The thing that passed between them in that moment was not trust. Trust was something built over time, and they had no time. But it was something in the same family, the specific recognition of 2 people who have independently reached the same conclusion about a situation and are now deciding whether to act on it together. Cancel the meeting, she said. Canceling it sends a signal that... Canceling it keeps 14 people alive. Gregor is planning to use the meeting to take out your leadership structure in one move and claim the organization in the aftermath. That's what a man does when he's already crossed the line with his boss and has 12 hired men and nothing to lose. She put both hands on the table. He's not after me anymore. I was never the point. I was the wound to his pride, and he dealt with that last night through Webb. Her jaw tightened. The meeting is how he takes the throne. Damien sat completely still. Cancel the meeting, she said again, and then tell me where Gregor's other properties are, every location he's used in the past 6 months, because I'm going to find him before he finds another way in. Why? Damien said. The question was simple, and she knew what it was asking. Not why find Gregor, but why her? Why now? Why, after everything she'd done to dismantle his organization, was she sitting across from him and offering to protect it? She thought about Thomas Webb. She thought about the folder. She thought about 40 minutes. Because this is my fault, she said. He found the folder because I kept the folder, and I should have delivered it faster, and I didn't. Webb is in the hospital because I made a calculation about timing that was wrong. She straightened up. I don't get to walk away from the consequences of my own mistakes. Not again. She said the last 2 words before she decided to and didn't take them back. Damien looked at her for a long time. There's a property on Costner, he said. Gregor used it as a secondary office. He's used it when he's wanted distance from the main organization. He paused. I'll cancel the meeting. She nodded once, picked up her jacket. Miss Mercer. She stopped. If Gregor kills you on that property, I need you to understand that what I can do in response is limited while the federal case is... I understand, she said. I'm not sure you do. She looked at him, at the tiredness in his face, at the weight that was still there, that had been there since before she walked in, that she now understood more about than she had an hour ago. I've been going into situations alone for 3 years, she said. The difference between this one and all the others is that this time someone knows where I'm going. She walked out. The 2 men in the kitchen, visible through the door crack, watched her go. Neither moved. She walked out of the restaurant into the cold morning and turned toward Costner and started walking. And she was halfway down the block before she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd said in there. Not the tactical information, not the deal or the lack of deal, but the last 2 words. Not again. She'd said it to Damien Volkov. She'd said it out loud in a room with the most dangerous man in Chicago. 3 years of keeping that sentence internal. And it had come out across a table in a closed restaurant over 2 untouched cups of coffee. She walked faster. The shoulder hurt. Thomas Webb was in a hospital bed 40 minutes from where he should have been. The Costner property was 11 blocks north. 11 blocks to think about whether going in alone was the last mistake she'd make, or just another one in the line of them that had been accumulating since a mountain village 4 years ago, and whether the difference between those 2 options was something she still had enough left to control. The Costner property was a former auto parts distributor, 2 stories, brick exterior that had gone from red to the particular brown-gray that Chicago brick went after enough winters. The signage had been removed, but you could see where it had been. Cleaner brick in the shape of letters. A ghost of a business name that Sienna didn't try to read because she was spending her attention on the windows. 2nd floor, east side. A light that had been on when she'd come around the corner and went off 30 seconds after she stopped moving. Someone inside had seen her arrive. She stood on the opposite side of Costner in the recessed entrance of a dry cleaner that wasn't open yet and thought about this. The light going off meant awareness, not panic. If Gregor had panicked, he'd have moved people to the windows. The fact that he'd just killed the light meant he was comfortable. Comfortable meant he thought he controlled the situation, which meant he thought he had more people or more advantage than she did. He probably had both. She had a bruised shoulder, no equipment, 60 hours without real sleep, and 11 months of knowing how Gregor Vance moved through a building based on surveillance and the testimony of people who'd worked for him and then stopped. She thought about what Marcus had said. You've got no one to call when you're the one who needs backup. She thought about Ray, somewhere in a shelter intake under a name that wasn't his. She thought about Pavel, who had the resources, but whose resources came with a cost she hadn't finished calculating. She thought about Damian Volkov sitting in a closed restaurant canceling a meeting and wondering if she was going to come back from 11 blocks north. She pushed off the doorway and crossed Kostner and went around the back. The rear of the property had a loading area, concrete apron, roll-up door, a standard entry door to its right with a light above it that was off. 2 vehicles parked on the apron. One she recognized as the style Gregor's hired people favored, large, dark, American-made. The other was older and smaller, and she didn't recognize it. She crouched behind the larger vehicle and listened. Inside, voices, low, indistinct, the kind of conversation that carried the rhythm of an argument without yielding specific words. At least 2 people, maybe 3. And underneath the voices, something else. A sound she had to work to identify before it resolved into what it was. Someone in pain. Controlled, managed, deliberate. The kind of sound a person made when they were trying not to make a sound and not entirely succeeding. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't accounted for a hostage. She'd come in thinking about Gregor and 12 hired men and a secondary property, and she hadn't built a hostage into the equation because there hadn't been a hostage in the intelligence. She ran a fast inventory of what she knew. Thomas Webb was in the hospital, critical but stable, which meant he wasn't here. The other 3 witnesses were safe. Ray was in shelter. Marcus was relocated. Who? She moved to the entry door and put her hand flat against the surface. No particular reason, just the gesture of a person trying to read a space through what it offered, and listen to the sounds from inside resolve themselves into something clearer. The argument rhythms. The managed pain sound coming from directly inside and slightly left, ground level. Ground level was the old parts floor. She'd seen the building layout in a city property record she'd pulled 3 months ago when she'd been building the file on Gregor's Chicago footprint. Ground floor, large open warehouse space, manager's office in the northwest corner, bathroom. Second floor, the former distribution office, connected by internal stairs in the northeast corner. She tried the door handle. Unlocked. Which meant they wanted someone to come in this way. Which meant the door was the wrong choice. She backed away from the door and looked at the roll-up. The roll-up was motorized, and opening it would make noise. She looked at the wall above the roll-up, loading bay second floor window, the kind of architectural remnant that existed because someone had decided they needed to look down onto the loading area from the distribution office and had never considered it a security concern. It was 12 feet up. The shoulder was going to have an opinion about this. She climbed the vehicle nearest the wall, stood on its roof with the particular careful balance of someone doing precise things on an imprecise surface, and reached the window ledge with both hands. The shoulder sent a signal that was beyond suggestion and below incapacitation, and she worked in the space between those 2 points, pulling herself up, getting a knee on the ledge, getting through the window in a way that was functional rather than elegant, and brought her silently into what turned out to be a storage room full of metal shelving and old binders and the smell of a space that hadn't been properly used in years. She held still, breathed. Let the pain in the shoulder find its new baseline. Below her, through the floor, the argument had stopped. That was bad. She moved through the storage room to the interior door, which was ajar, and through the gap she could see the distribution office. A long room with windows overlooking the ground floor warehouse through dirty interior glass, desks pushed to the walls. A space that had become a command post in the way that spaces became command posts when people with guns decided they needed somewhere to put a table and some equipment. 3 men. One at the window overlooking the ground floor. One at a desk with a laptop that was the only source of light in the room. One standing in the center of the room looking at his phone. Not Gregor. She scanned the room twice, and Gregor was not in it. The man at the window turned and said something to the man with the phone, and she caught the word downstairs, and she understood that Gregor was on the ground floor with whoever was making that sound. She did the math she did not want to do. 3 up here, Gregor downstairs, unknown number, downstairs with him. She could not handle 3 men in a room simultaneously without equipment. Not clean, not without noise that would alert the floor below. She needed to separate them. She looked at the laptop. The glow of it on the desk, the screen showing what looked like a surveillance feed. She looked more carefully. A surveillance feed of the outside of this building. 4 camera angles. And in one of the angles, the rear loading area, a figure climbing a vehicle. Her. From 2 minutes ago, they'd already seen her come in. She was through the door before she finished processing this, because the alternative to moving was standing still, and the room knew she was here and standing still was finished as an option. The man at the window turned first. He was closest to the door and had the fastest reaction, and she hit him with the door itself, driving it into him, following through with her body weight to pin him against the window frame, and the window behind him, old glass in an old frame, cracked with the impact. He made a sound that was half grunt, half something higher, and she drove her elbow into the back of his neck at the specific point that ended the conversation. 1. The man with the phone had his hand up, and the phone becoming a weapon, or becoming a radio, she couldn't tell which, and she crossed the space to him in 3 steps, and the 3rd step was the one where her left boot caught the edge of a pushed-aside desk chair, and she stumbled, genuinely stumbled, the kind of stumble that happened when you were running on no sleep and a bad shoulder, and the body decided that right now was the moment to be human. He hit her. Not with the phone. He dropped the phone and hit her with his fist, and he was not small, and the hit landed across the right side of her jaw, and she went sideways and caught herself on the desk, and her vision went briefly specific, not dark, not stars, the specific high-contrast clarity that came from a solid hit to the head, where the world became very sharp and very loud for 2 seconds. She heard the 3rd man moving behind her. She pushed off the desk and spun and ducked below what the 3rd man was swinging. Something in his hand, she registered it as metal, but not a firearm, a tool of some kind, and came up inside his reach and hit him twice in quick succession, short punches with no room for full extension, the kind that were about location rather than force, ribs, and then the back of the head when he folded, and he went down. The man who'd hit her was still up. They looked at each other across the dark room. He was breathing hard. She was breathing hard. The jaw was throbbing. The shoulder was worse than before. She'd used it wrong on the 3rd man, and she was going to pay for that shortly. "Last chance to sit down," she said. Her voice came out rougher than usual from the hit. He charged instead. She was out of space, the desk behind her, the downed 3rd man to her left, the wall to her right. And she could not get out of his path, so she went into it instead, stepping toward him rather than away, which meant the impact happened at half the velocity it would have at full extension, and she used his momentum to redirect him into the desk, and the desk went over, and he went with it, and she came down on top of him and pinned his right arm under her knee and held the position until he stopped trying to move. 4 seconds. 5. He stopped. She stood up. Her hands were shaking. She put them flat on the overturned desk and breathed through it. This happened sometimes. Not fear, not adrenaline exactly, but the specific physical tax of operating past capacity, collecting its payment at the first available moment of stillness. She breathed through it until it passed. 12 seconds. From below, nothing. Gregor hadn't heard, or Gregor had heard and was making a different calculation. She moved to the door to the stairs. The ground floor was dark except for a work light in the northwest corner, the manager's office area, where someone had set up the kind of functional temporary space that people set up when they expected to be somewhere for hours but not days. A cot, a cooler, a folding table with equipment on it that she identified from the stairs as communication gear. Gregor was standing at the folding table with his back to her, and tied to a chair 6 feet from him, zip ties on the wrists, and a cut above the left eye that had bled and dried in the way cuts did when time passed after they stopped bleeding, was Pavel. She stopped on the bottom step. Pavel looked at her. His face, normally the most controlled face she'd encountered in 18 months of watching Volkov's organization from the outside, was doing something it was not accustomed to doing, which was showing something. Not fear. He was past fear, or he'd put it somewhere she couldn't see. He was showing a warning. His eyes moved toward Gregor and then back to her, and the message in the movement was clear and specific. Not yet. Gregor turned around. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked like a man who had spent 3 days running toward a moment and had just arrived at it. "Close the building down," she said. "Just you and Pavel?" "The others are outside." He said it like it didn't matter, which meant they weren't. He'd dismissed them or they'd left, and the reason for that was the same reason there was one cot and one chair and a conversation that was going to happen in private. Gregor had been building towards something specific, and he needed an audience of one for it. That was useful and dangerous simultaneously. "You hit Webb," she said. "I found the folder." He shrugged. It was not a casual shrug. It was a performed one, the shrug of a man who needed to demonstrate that consequences other people cared about didn't register for him. He was in the folder. He was a civilian. He had nothing to do with. He was going to testify. He said it flatly. "Don't make it more than it is." She looked at him. At 20 years of Damian Volkov's organization, written in the way he stood, the way he held his hands loose at his sides, the way his eyes had the specific quality of a person who had made every calculation in advance and was now simply executing. He was 60 pounds heavier than her and 4 inches taller, and he'd been doing this since before she'd known what she wanted to do with her life. She'd been in worse positions. She wasn't sure she was remembering that correctly right now. "You went around Volkov," she said. "Volkov is finished." He said it without heat, a statement of operational reality. He's been finished since he started asking questions about the past instead of protecting the future. A man who second-guesses a 20-year empire because of a woman with a camera. A man who lets one of his captains run a trafficking operation under his name for 4 years isn't protecting anything, she said. He's just pretending to. Something changed in Gregor's face. Slight. A tightening around the jaw that meant she'd found a nerve that wasn't supposed to be accessible. "You knew about Marlowe," she said. She watched his face, watched the jaw. "You knew and you didn't tell Damien." "I didn't." "How long?" She took a step toward him. Not aggressive, the opposite, slow and direct. The approach of someone who has decided that distance is the wrong choice. "How long did you know Marlowe was running his own operation under the organization's cover?" "That's not... Because if you knew for a year, you were complicit. If you knew for 2 years, you were profiting." She took another step. "If you knew for 4 years, then the intel that got corrupted, the intel that sent my unit to the wrong location, you knew the source was compromised and you didn't pull it." The room was very quiet. Pavel, in the chair, was very still. Gregor looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger. Anger she'd expected. This was something older than anger. The specific look of a man who had built a story about himself over 20 years and was watching one precise cut expose the structure underneath. 3 children, she said. 5 adults. Wrong location, wrong target, corrupted intelligence. And you knew the source. "You don't know what I knew?" "Then tell me." He moved. Not the charge she'd anticipated. He moved to the folding table and picked up something, and she registered it and adjusted in the same moment. A weapon, a firearm, not pointed at her but held, and the held not pointing was its own message. "You've been taking apart things that took 20 years to build," he said. "You know what that looks like from where I'm standing?" "I know what it looks like from where I'm standing," she said. "It looks like things that should have been taken apart." Webb was going to testify. "Webb is in a hospital." "Webb..." He stopped. Something in his face shifted. A micro-expression, gone fast, but she caught it. "Webb shouldn't have been in that folder." She went very still. "What does that mean?" "It means..." He stopped again. "Gregor." Her voice was very quiet now. The particular quiet that was not calm but was below panic. "What do you mean he should have been in the folder?" "I mean, he wasn't on my list." He said it with the specific carefulness of a man who had just heard his own sentence and understood what it exposed. "I only pulled 3 names from the folder. Webb wasn't one of them." The floor shifted under her, not literally, but she felt it, the specific feeling of a foundation moving. "Then who hit Webb?" she said. Gregor looked at her. For the first time in this conversation, he looked uncertain. "My people found the folder," he said. "I pulled 3 names. The folder went back." "Back where?" "I left it on the property. Laundry building." He said it slowly. like he was working it out as he spoke. I had people in and out of there for 2 hours after you ran. The folder was on the table when I left. She was already thinking through it. The laundry facility. Gregor's people had been in it, and then who else had been in it? Who else had known about it? Who had known the location? Marcus, Ray, Pavel, who was currently in a chair with zip ties on his wrists and a cut above his eye. She turned and looked at Pavel. Pavel's expression had not changed from the warning she'd read on the stairs. He was watching her work through it with the focused attention of a man who had been waiting for her to arrive at a specific conclusion. Pavel, she said, who else knew the location of the laundry facility? Pavel said nothing. His eyes moved to Gregor and back. There was a fourth person, she said. Someone who knew the location and wasn't Gregor's team. Someone who had the folder after Gregor's people left. Still nothing from Pavel. Pavel. She moved toward him. Not fast, deliberate. Who put you in that chair? Gregor said behind her. I did. I know you did. I'm asking why he's not answering me. A long silence. Then Pavel said very carefully, because who put you in the laundry facility, Ms. Mercer, is a more useful question than who put me in this chair. She turned that sentence over, examined it. She had found the laundry facility on her own. She had identified it 3 months ago from a city property record. She had told no one, not Marcus, not Ray. She had relocated there because it was a backup location she'd selected independently. Except she had called Pavel from the laundry facility, on the real phone. The call that had put her voice and her position in the same signal, the call that Pavel had answered. And between that call and Gregor's men arriving 40 minutes later, the only person who had known she was at the laundry facility was the person she'd called. She looked at Pavel. Pavel looked back at her with an expression that was very level and very tired and contained. Underneath it, something that she had not expected to see on the face of a man who had worked for Damian Volkov for 11 years. It looked like guilt. You sent Gregor to the laundry facility, she said. I sent the location to someone, Pavel said carefully. It wasn't intended to reach Gregor. Then who was it intended to reach? He said a name she didn't recognize. And then he said the thing that made the whole structure shift, not fall, not collapse cleanly, but shift the way weight shifted when the distribution changed, when something that had been load-bearing was removed and everything above it lurched. He's Reyes's informant, Pavel said. He's been inside our organization for 14 months, and he passed the location to Gregor because Gregor is the outcome he's been managing toward, not Volkov's arrest, Gregor's takeover. Because Gregor's organization would be smaller and more manageable, and Pavel stopped. Because a smaller, manageable criminal organization is more useful to certain people than a dismantled one. Because a dismantled one creates a vacuum that nobody can control. The room was very quiet. Gregor, behind her, had stopped moving. She turned around and looked at him. He was looking at Pavel with an expression that was new. Not the performed indifference, not the controlled professional, but the face of a man who was hearing something that rearranged what he thought he'd understood about the past 3 days. You were being managed, she said to Gregor. Someone inside Rhea's office fed you information, the folder, Webb's location, the timing of everything. You weren't running a takeover. You were running someone else's script. Gregor's jaw worked. Which means the meeting tonight. She stopped. The meeting. The meeting Damian had agreed to cancel. The meeting that Pavel had known about. The meeting that Pavel had known about and had been in contact with Reyes's informant about. The meeting isn't canceled, she said. She looked at Pavel. Pavel said nothing, which was its own answer. You didn't relay my instruction to Damian, she said. Not to Pavel, to the room, to herself, working it out fast because fast was what the situation required. Or you did, and someone else uncanceled it. Either way, the meeting happens tonight, and Gregor's people move on it, and 14 people are in one location, and... She stopped. She pulled out the cheap phone she'd bought that morning. Dialed Damian's number, the one she didn't have, had never had. She looked at the folding table, at the communication equipment, at the contacts loaded in Gregor's system that were visible on the screen of the tablet open on the table. She crossed to the table. Gregor said, "Don't." She looked at him, at the weapon still in his hand, at the 20 years of story he'd been telling himself, and the 3 days of being someone else's instrument, and the specific look on his face of a man who is beginning to understand the difference. "You're going to shoot me," she said, "or you're going to help me stop 14 people from dying tonight in an operation that someone else designed to end your career along with theirs." Gregor looked at her for a long moment. "Cut Pavel loose," she said, "and give me the tablet." The gun came up. Her heart rate did something she registered and set aside. The shoulder was bad. The jaw from the hit upstairs was bad. She was standing in a building with 3 unconscious men above her and 1 man with a weapon in front of her, and Pavel in a chair behind her, and 11 hours until a meeting that hadn't been canceled convened with 14 people who didn't know they were walking into something that had been arranged for them. Gregor looked at the tablet, at her, at the weapon in his own hand. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he'd built for 20 years and seeing, for the first time, that it had been built on ground that someone else had chosen for him. He lowered the gun. Not all the way. Halfway. Which was not safety, but was possibility. And possibility was what she had to work with, and she had always been better at working with possibility than with certainty. Because certainty was a thing that had stopped being available to her 4 years ago in a mountain village, and she had learned, slowly and at real cost, to build from what she had instead of mourning what she didn't. She reached across the table and took the tablet. "Cut him loose," she said again, and this time Gregor moved, slowly, deliberately, across the room, and she turned her attention to the tablet and found the contact that connected to Damien's direct line and made the call that everything that came next was going to depend on. It rang once. Damien answered on the first ring. "The meeting," Sienna said. "Did you cancel it?" A pause. Short, but not short enough. Pavel relayed the instruction. "Pavel is zip-tied to a chair on the Kostner property and has been since last night." She watched Gregor cutting through the zip ties with a folding knife he'd taken from his jacket pocket. The motions deliberate and careful in the way a man moved when he was doing something he hadn't entirely decided to do, but was doing anyway. "The meeting is still on. Someone uncanceled it, or it was never canceled. Either way, your lieutenants are walking into a room tonight that someone has been designing for 3 months. The silence this time was different, denser. "How long?" Damien said. 11 hours. Maybe less, depending on when people start arriving." She looked at the tablet screen, Gregor's communication network, the contacts and the location pings, and the operational structure of a man who had been running a parallel organization inside Volkov's for longer than she'd understood. "I need the meeting location, and I need you to get there before your people do." "The meeting location is—" "Don't say it on this line." She looked at the communication equipment on the table. "Gregor's system is clean. Use the number on this tablet, and I'll call you back in 4 minutes." She ended the call. Pavel was standing now, rubbing his wrists where the zip ties had been. The cut above his eye had reopened slightly, not bleeding freely, just the thin seep of a wound that had been disturbed. He looked at her with the expression of a man assessing damage, internal and external simultaneously. "The informant," she said to him. "The name you gave me. How long have you known?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks? She kept her voice level. It took some work. 6 weeks, and you called him after I told you the laundry location. I called him because I needed to know whose side he was on. Pavel said it without apology, the flat statement of a man who made operational decisions and lived with the outcomes. I needed to know if what you'd told me, the meeting, Gregor, all of it, was information he already had. If he already had it, the risk profile was different. And when he moved on web. I didn't know he'd moved on web until this morning. Something crossed Pavel's face, not guilt exactly, but the functional equivalent, the thing that replaced guilt in people who had trained themselves not to feel it, and then ran into a situation where the training wasn't enough. That was not the intended outcome. Thomas Webb is in intensive care. I know. He's 47 years old and he has a daughter in Minneapolis. I know, Pavel said again, and this time the 2 words had weight behind them, real weight, the kind that didn't come from performance. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the tablet and called Damien back. The meeting location was a private event space in the West Loop, a building Volkov's organization had used for legitimate business functions for years, which made it invisible in exactly the right way, the kind of location that appeared in records and created no suspicion because it had always appeared in records. 14 people. 7 of Damien's senior lieutenants, 3 external partners from organizations in Detroit and Minneapolis, who had been doing business with Volkov's network for over a decade, and 4 additional figures whose roles Pavel described in the car. They were moving now, Gregor driving, Pavel in the passenger seat, Sienna in the back with the tablet. As financial coordinators, the specific kind of people who never appeared in intelligence files because they were careful and quiet and never touched anything that could be held. The informant's name was Brian Letts. 43. 11 years with the FBI, 14 months embedded in Volkov's financial operation under a cover identity that Pavel had constructed himself, which was the particular irony of the situation that Pavel had not commented on, and Sienna had not pointed out, because there was no version of pointing it out that made anything better. Letts had been feeding information to Rhea's office for 14 months. Legitimate information, real intelligence, the kind that had genuinely advanced the RICO case. And simultaneously, he had been managing a secondary outcome, the kind that certain people in certain positions managed when the primary outcome was too clean, too total, too disruptive to the specific ecosystem of controlled criminality that some people found more useful than its absence. A dismantled Volkov organization created a vacuum, 14 rival factions and independents moving into the space. Chaos. Unpredictability. The specific kind of mess that was harder to manage than a known quantity. Gregor's organization, smaller, rougher, already known, already mapped, was the controlled replacement. Letts had been building toward it for months. Not eliminating Volkov's operation, but amputating it, replacing the head, creating something that looked like a victory and functioned like a continuity. Sienna had understood this in the Costner building, and she understood it more fully now in the back of Gregor's car, watching the city move past the windows, working through the layers of it. "Reyes doesn't know," she said. No, Pavel said. "She thinks Letts is clean. She built her case on his intelligence. She has no reason to question it. And the Dreiser file I sent her." Pavel was quiet for a moment. "Letts will have told her the file came from an unreliable source. He'll have contextualized it in a way that slows her response." Sienna thought about Diana Reyes reading the file, about the phone call to her investigator, "Clear your Thursday." Reyes was not slow. Reyes was the opposite of slow. But Letts was inside her office and inside her trust, and that was the kind of advantage that moved faster than competence could correct for. "Call her," Sienna said to Pavel. "Not through any channel Letts has access to. Do you have a direct line?" "Not one that's safe." "Then we go to her." "We have 11 hours?" "We go to her first." She said it in a way that didn't invite discussion. Because if Letts knows the meeting is still on and knows we're moving, the first thing he does is warn whoever is positioned for tonight. And the second thing he does is control what Reyes knows and when she knows it. We take that away from him first. Gregor from the driver's seat said nothing. He'd been saying nothing since the Costner building in a way that Sienna was paying attention to. Not checked out, not disengaged, but processing. She'd watched enough people in the hours after a significant realization to recognize the quality of his silence. He was reassembling something. Taking the structure of the past 3 days apart and looking at the components. "Gregor," she said. He looked at her in the rear view. His eyes were steady. "The 12 men you hired. Where are they now?" "2 locations. I can reach them. When we're done with Reyes, I need them redirected. Not to the meeting, away from it. Somewhere visible and documented, so when tonight happens, there's a record of where they were." He held her eyes in the mirror for a moment. "You're protecting me. I'm making sure that when this is over, the story is accurate. You are being used. That's true. It should be the record." Something moved in his face. Not gratitude. He wasn't the type for gratitude, and she wasn't asking for it. Something more functional, a recalibration. "I'll reach them," he said. Diana Reyes's office was in the Dirksen Federal Building, and getting to her directly, bypassing Letts, bypassing the front channels, bypassing the specific institutional machinery that Letts had access to, required the kind of lateral thinking that Sienna had gotten good at over 3 years of working around systems rather than through them. She called the number she'd found 11 months ago, not Reyes's office line, not her cell, but the number of a courthouse paralegal named Sandra, who had worked with Reyes for 9 years, and who Sienna had cultivated through the same patient, genuine human contact she'd used for every source she'd built, and who had her own reasons, private and specific, for wanting Volkov's operation dismantled. Sandra answered on the third ring. I need 20 minutes with Reyes, Sienna said. In person, today. Through you, not through the office. A pause. She's... Sandra, she said it quietly. It's about Let's. The pause that followed was the kind that meant the name had landed the way she'd expected it to. Give me an hour, Sandra said. They met in a parking structure 2 blocks from the federal building. Reyes arrived alone, which was either trust or calculation or both, and she looked at Sienna, the jacket, the jaw that had swelled slightly on the right side from the hit upstairs, the overall presentation of a person who had been awake for a very long time, with the expression of a woman who had spent 17 years in federal law and had learned to read situations by what they didn't say. You're Mercer, Reyes said. Yes. You've been sending me material for 4 months. Yes. Reyes looked at Pavel, at Gregor. Her face did something that was almost nothing but wasn't. You want to tell me why you're standing next to 2 members of the Volkov organization? Because they're how I got here faster than Let's could stop me, Sienna said. She said the name plainly and watched Reyes' face do the thing faces did when something they'd been certain of became uncertain. Not collapse. Reyes was not the kind of person whose face collapsed, but a specific tightening, a reorganization, the face of a woman who was very fast and was already processing. Brian Letts, Sienna said, 14 months embedded. You built a significant portion of your case on his intelligence. He's been managing a secondary outcome on the side. Gregor Vance's takeover of the Volkov organization, smaller and controllable, positioned as a win for your office while functionally maintaining the network. She laid it out the way she'd lay out documentation, flat, sequential, without drama, because Reyes didn't need drama. Reyes needed structure. Thomas Webb is in ICU because Let's passed his location through Gregor's network. Webb was in a folder that Let's access through a back channel to Gregor's operation. Reyes was very still. There's a meeting tonight, Sienna continued. West Loop, 14 people from Volkov's organization and external partners. It was supposed to be canceled. It wasn't. Let's is managing the timeline. Reyes said, What do you need from me? Not can you prove this. Not how do I know you're credible. Straight to the operational question, which told Sienna everything she needed to know about why Reyes had built the case she'd built in the time she'd built it. Tonight I need the meeting covered by people who are not connected to Let's. Not his contacts, not his channels. I need Let's managed, not arrested yet, contained. So he can't warn whoever is positioned for tonight. And I need someone with authority to receive what Pavel is going to give you. She looked at Pavel. He reached inside his jacket and produced a drive. Small, unremarkable, the kind of thing that was easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking at. 14 months of Let's secondary communications. I've been collecting it since I identified him 6 weeks ago. Reyes took the drive, looked at it, looked at Pavel. You've been running a counter-surveillance on your own organization's FBI informant. I've been running counter-surveillance on an asset that was being used against the organization's interests, Pavel said. The distinction matters to me. It'll matter to a jury too, Reyes said, and it wasn't entirely without a dark edge. She pocketed the drive. The meeting location, Sienna told her. Reyes made one phone call, right there in the parking structure, to a number that she dialed from memory. She spoke for 90 seconds in the clipped, specific language of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how much information was required and how much was excess. She ended the call and looked at Sienna. Tonight, she said, you stay out of the building. That depends on what happens. It's not a negotiation, Mercer. If you're inside that building tonight, it creates chain of custody problems I can't fix in a courtroom. Sienna looked at her. Reyes looked back. This was the version of an immovable force meeting an immovable object that happened without violence. Just 2 people who were both right about different things simultaneously. I'll stay out of the building, Sienna said, unless someone's life is at risk. That's not... It's the best I can do. Reyes held her gaze for another moment. Then she nodded. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of someone who understood that this was the actual shape of the situation, and arguing for a cleaner shape wasn't going to change it. Webb, Sienna said. He needs protection at the hospital. Already done, Reyes said. As of an hour ago. She paused. He's going to make it, The doctors this morning said he's going to make it. Sienna absorbed this. Let it settle somewhere that she'd been keeping empty since 1:30 in the morning. Good, she said. It was all she said. Reyes watched her say it and saw, Sienna suspected, more than she would have wanted her to see. Reyes was that kind of person. The West Loop building at 7 that night was lit from inside, warm light through the lobby windows, the kind of visual that said professional event to anyone passing on the street. Sienna was on a rooftop across the avenue with a sightline to the building's entrance, watching arrivals. She had no equipment, no camera. She'd borrowed a pair of binoculars from a contact she'd reached through Sandra, a former investigator who now did insurance work and who had met Sienna once, 2 years ago, in a context he'd found confusing but had not found threatening, and she was using them to watch people arrive and count. Gregor was 3 blocks north with his 12 hired men, redirected, documented, nowhere near the building. He'd made the calls himself. She'd listened to him do it. He'd used the voice of a man who had given orders for 20 years and was giving an order now that cost him something, and he'd done it without letting the cost show in his voice, which was its own kind of discipline. Pavel was with Rhea's people, not arrested, cooperating, the specific liminal state of a man who has spent 11 years on one side of a line and has stepped to the other side and is waiting to find out what the ground feels like there. The arrivals were mostly complete by 7:20. 11 of the 14 confirmed, she estimated, based on the vehicles and the faces she could make out through the binoculars. She didn't know where the other 3 were, and she filed that as incomplete information and kept watching. At 7:34, a vehicle she didn't recognize pulled up, and a man got out who wasn't one of the 14. She put the binoculars on him. He was carrying something, not obviously, the way people carried things when they didn't want you to notice. She adjusted the focus and looked at his hands, and the way he held them close to his body, and the specific tension in his shoulders that was not the tension of a person going to a meeting. She was already moving when he went through the door. She'd told Reyes she'd stay out unless a life was at risk. She hadn't said how she'd know. She was making that determination now, on the roof, moving toward the access stairway, and the determination was that she'd seen enough people carry enough things in enough configurations to know that what she'd seen was not a person going to a meeting. She went down the stairs at a controlled run. The lobby was unoccupied. When she came through the building's side entrance, Reyes's people had cleared it, she understood, had positioned inside the event space itself. The man she'd seen had gone through the front door 40 seconds ahead of her. She moved through the lobby toward the event space entrance, a set of double doors with light showing underneath them. She put her hand on one door, pushed it open 2 inches, looked through. The 14 people were seated, a long table, mid-conversation. Reyes's people were visible now. She could identify them by the specific quality of how they were positioned, not seated, standing at points around the room that made sense as coverage. The man she'd followed was not in the room. She let the door close and turned and looked at the lobby and thought about where a person went when they entered a building and then didn't enter the room they were supposed to enter. The stairwell door to her left was not fully latched. She went through it. I was on the landing above, and he heard her at the same moment she saw him, and what happened next was not clean or cinematic or anything other than what it actually was. 2 people in a stairwell, one of whom had been sent here with a specific purpose, and one of whom had decided to interrupt it, and the confined space and the concrete walls and the metal railing and the specific terrible acoustic of a stairwell that made every sound too loud. He was bigger than her. He moved like someone who knew what he was doing. He didn't panic when he saw her, which meant he was professional, which meant she needed to be very precise because professional people in contained spaces with a purpose didn't make the kinds of errors that gave her the margin she'd had at the laundry facility. She didn't give him time to settle. She went directly at him, up the half-flight of stairs between them, closing distance fast because distance was what firearms needed. And she was not carrying a firearm, and he might be. And the stairwell wall on her left and the railing on her right were both things she used, bouncing her line of approach off the wall to come at him from an angle that the geometry of the stairs made difficult to track. He caught her by the jacket. She let him. The grab committed his hands, and committed hands couldn't do other things. And she used the grip to redirect him into the railing rather than fighting it, and the railing caught him across the lower back with his own weight behind it, and his breath went, and in the moment his breath went, she got her hand on the thing he'd been carrying and took it. She didn't look at it. She was already moving, putting herself between him and the stairwell below, the door back to the lobby, the exit. He came at her again. I was hurting. The railing had done real damage. She could see it in how he was holding himself. But pain was not a deterrent for certain kinds of people, and he was one of those kinds. She met him at the bottom of the half-flight, and it was ugly, and it cost her. The shoulder, the jaw, that hadn't healed. 2 impacts she took because she couldn't avoid both, and had to choose which one was survivable. And when it was over, she was sitting on the bottom step of the landing, and he was not standing up, and she was looking at her own hands and breathing. The stairwell door opened. 2 of Rhea's people. They took in the scene with the fast professional assessment of people trained to assess scenes. He came in through the front after the room was sealed, she said. He wasn't on the list. She held up what she'd taken from him. They looked at it, and their faces did the thing faces did when they saw something in a situation that confirmed what they'd feared about the situation. She handed it over and stood up and held the railing until she was sure her legs were going to do what she needed them to do. They did. Barely. By midnight, it was over in the way that these things were over. Not cleanly, not completely, but the irreversible part was done. Letts was in federal custody. Reyes had moved on him at 9:40, 2 hours after the West Loop operation concluded, using a team that had no connection to his contact network. He had not seen it coming in the specific way that people didn't see things coming when they believed they were managing the situation, when the sense of control was itself the blind spot. The 14 people in the event space were processed. Some were cooperative, some were not. Reyes would spend the next 6 months untangling what the night had produced, and she would do it without Let's version of events shaping what she knew. And Sienna understood that the work from that night forward was Reyes and would stay Reyes. And that was how it was supposed to work. Damian Volkov turned himself in at 11:15, not dramatically, not through a press release or a staged surrender. He walked into the Dirksen Federal Building with a lawyer he'd called at 9 o'clock and handed over documentation that his lawyer had prepared over the preceding 2 hours. Documentation that Pavel had helped assemble. Documentation that represented 11 years of organizational records, financial trails, names and locations, and transaction histories that extended far beyond Chicago. Sienna heard about it through Sandra at 11:45. She was sitting on a bench in a park 3 blocks from the Federal Building, not going anywhere in particular, not yet. The shoulder needed to stop being a problem she was working around and start being something she addressed. The jaw needed ice that she hadn't found yet. She sat on the bench and heard the information and sat with it. She'd spent 3 years building towards something she'd told herself was about justice and accountability and the specific correction of specific wrongs, and tonight had produced something that looked like all of those things, and she was sitting on a bench at midnight, and what she felt was not triumph. It was not the thing she'd imagined feeling. It was something quieter and harder to name, not emptiness, but the feeling of a weight distributed differently across your body after you've been carrying it one way for a very long time. She thought about the mountain, about 3 children and 5 adults, and a target that had been wrong, and an intelligence chain that had been corrupted by a dead man's greed. She thought about whether tonight had corrected that, whether correction was even the right word for what happened when you tried to balance something that couldn't be balanced. She decided that wasn't the right question. The right question was whether Thomas Webb was going to see his daughter in Minneapolis again, and the answer was yes. Whether the 8-year-old boy from the Hartman facility was in a position that was better than where he'd been 6 days ago, and the answer was yes. Whether Gregor Vance, who had been used and had made terrible choices and had, at the end, made a different choice, was going to face something that was closer to accurate than what would have happened if tonight had gone the other way. She thought about Ray, somewhere in a shelter intake under a name that wasn't his, starting something over. She'd check on him, not tonight. Her phone, the cheap prepaid, the only phone she still had, buzzed with a text from a number she didn't have stored. She looked at it. Webb's daughter landed an hour ago. He's awake. No name. She recognized the rhythm of the sentence as Sandra's. She put the phone in her pocket. She sat on the bench for another few minutes. The city made its noise around her. Traffic, the distance-muted sound of the elevated train somewhere east, the specific urban nighttime ambiance of a city that did not pause for events that had seemed, from inside them, enormous. Chicago was like that. It swallowed things. She stood up. Her body registered the standing as a formal complaint that she filed and did not act on. She walked. 3 weeks later, Gregor Vance sat across a table from a federal prosecutor and provided 6 hours of testimony that connected the remaining threads of Let's secondary operation to 3 other embedded informants in 2 other cities who had been running versions of the same management strategy. Controlled replacement rather than dismantlement, the specific institutional preference for knowable evil over unknown variables. Pavel provided financial records and organizational structure documentation that the RICO case had been unable to build from the outside. He negotiated a cooperation agreement that his lawyer described privately as better than he deserved and worse than he wanted, which Pavel told her later was probably accurate. Thomas Webb gave a statement from his hospital bed 11 days after the West Loop operation. His daughter was there. She held his hand while he talked. Sienna knew about the statement through Reyes, who called her directly, a first, to tell her that Webb's testimony had sealed the connection between Let's secondary network and 2 sitting city officials whose names had been in the documentation she'd been building for months. Reyes said it in the careful, precise language of a federal prosecutor, stripped of anything that sounded like gratitude. And Sienna listened in the same register, stripped of anything that sounded like expectation. And when the call ended, she thought that this was probably the most honest professional relationship she'd ever had with anyone. She had moved twice since the laundry facility. She was in a different part of the city now, still north, still in the kind of building that didn't ask questions, but with actual heat and a working bathroom, and a rent payment she made in cash through a management company that didn't look too hard at things. She didn't know how long she'd stay. She never knew how long she'd stay anywhere. That hadn't changed. The shoulder had required actual medical attention. She'd gone to a clinic 3 days after the West Loop operation and explained the injury in terms that the physician had accepted with the resigned acknowledgement of a doctor who had worked in Chicago long enough to not ask about the other explanations that presented themselves. Physical therapy was recommended. She was doing something that approximated it. She was at the clinic, different visit, different reason, when a woman sat down in the waiting room chair next to hers and put a cup of coffee on the table between them without being asked. She looked at the coffee, then at Damian Volkov. He looked different. Not physically different. Same build, same face, 11 years of hard decisions still visible in the way he held himself. But the specific quality of presence that powerful men carried, the gravity field of someone who expected rooms to arrange themselves around him, that was different, diminished, or maybe redistributed. She wasn't sure which. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I have a meeting with my lawyer at 2. This was on the way." He looked at the coffee. "I wasn't sure how you took it." "Black." "I guessed." He sat back in the chair and looked at the waiting room, the other people, the outdated magazines, the institutional light. He looked at it the way someone looked at things they hadn't had time to look at before. "Webb is going to be all right. I know. The 2 officials Reyes indicted this morning, did you see?" "I saw." He was quiet for a moment. "You started this 8 months ago with one operation on a rail yard. Do you know how it ends?" "It ends when I stop finding things that need to be taken apart," she said. "So no." Something crossed his face that might have been a smile in a different person. It didn't quite make it there. "The recovery center," he said, "the one for trafficking victims. I've arranged for a property donation. I want it to be a real building, not a warehouse." She looked at him. "Through an attorney," he said. "Nothing with my name on it. I'm told that's better for everyone." She thought about this, about whether to argue, about whether accepting anything from Damian Volkov undid something or compromised something or changed the accounting of what she'd done. She thought about the boy from the Hartman facility, the girl who'd frozen, the man with the infected hand. "It should be in a neighborhood that has services," she said, "not isolated, north or west side, somewhere with transit access. I'll tell the attorney. And the governance should be completely independent, no one connected to the organization." "Agreed. And I want Webb's name on it," she said. "If he's willing, he doesn't have to know where the property came from." Damien absorbed this. "That can be arranged." She picked up the coffee, drank from it. It was in fact black, and it was better than the gas station variety she'd been running on for 3 weeks. They sat in the waiting room for a while, not talking. The clinic around them made its ordinary sounds. Names called, doors opening and closing, the particular noise of a place where people came when something was wrong and left, when it was better or at least more managed. The military mission, Damien said finally. The mountain. If I had known what Marlowe was doing. You didn't, she said, but the culture of the organization made it possible, made the space for it. Yes. I've been thinking about that. He said it like someone reporting a fact rather than seeking absolution. I've been thinking about what it costs to build something on a foundation that the people inside it will eventually use against you, or against other people, because of how you taught them to think. She looked at the wall across from her, at a laminated poster about flu shots that was 6 months out of date. I've been thinking about that too, she said, just from the other direction. He looked at her. I spent 3 years thinking I could fix something from the outside by taking it apart piece by piece, she said. And the things I took apart did need to come apart. But there were people inside them who were not the thing itself, and I didn't always account for them. She thought about Ray, about the smoker outside the Hartman door who'd told her there were kids inside and had chosen, in that small specific moment, differently than he'd been trained to choose. About Gregor, who had been used and had done terrible things and had, at the end, stood in a kitchen in Kostner and lowered a gun. About Pavel, who had made a decision about Letts that had been wrong in outcome but had been made from something that wasn't simple self-interest, and who was sitting in federal cooperation, now building the evidentiary record that would outlast all of them. None of it is clean, she said. It never is. No, Damien said. It isn't. His lawyer's office called at 5 minutes to 2. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, the motion of a man whose body still remembered the gestures of a person with power, even when the power was gone. He looked at her for a moment. You defeated the strongest organization in this city, he said, without becoming it. I didn't defeat anything, she said. Things collapsed from the inside. I just kept standing near them. He considered this. That might be the same thing. He left. She sat in the waiting room until her name was called, and when it was called, she stood up and went through the door, and the clinic made its ordinary sounds around her, and the city continued its indifferent machinery outside the windows, and she thought, for the first time in a long time, about something other than the next thing that needed doing. She thought about the boy's voice in the Hartman facility. Are you going to be okay? She thought about what she would say if he asked her that now, 3 weeks later, with the shoulder in actual medical treatment, and Webb alive and Reyes building a case that would take years and hold. She thought about what honest answer she would give. She didn't know yet. She was working on it. The physician called her name again, closer now, and she went in and sat down on the examination table and answered the question she was asked. And outside the window, Chicago continued doing what Chicago did, which was survive, badly and loudly, and without particular grace, the same way she did, the same way most things worth anything did. Not by being unbreakable, by breaking and continuing anyway.